On the front of the church building in the High Street, there are two poster boards. One is the current theme title, signed, sealed, delivered, and the other is an image. And depending how quickly you look at the image, or what way you look at the image, you might either see a closed barrier or an open barrier. If you look at it quickly, you might think, well, there's just a closed barrier, or maybe two barriers. Or maybe you might look at it again and say, well, actual fact, the barrier I thought was closed is actually open. And in that image, I could move forward. But maybe there's a barrier there that was there that's now been moved. The idea, of course, is to make you think and maybe remind you of a particularly good song. One of the reasons for delivered and sealed as part of the title comes from the fact that we're reading a letter that was sent round to be read out loud to groups of Jesus followers in the first century, trying to make sense of what it is to live out the Jesus movement under the pressure of the Roman Empire. The letter is called The Revelation. The writer John's had a set of experiences from God that he's trying to capture and he's trying to express. So it's a revealing, it's an uncovering, it's a glimpse actually into realities that are pressing in on us but aren't always obvious on the surface. And so his visions are full of signs and symbols, which is where the signed part of the title comes from. One of the visions is of an open door. The door is open into heaven, what these sets of scriptures seem to describe, the term they describe for where God is at work, behind the scenes. So this door is open, and among other things, John has seen a throne with someone on it, and he's seen a lamb that looks like it was slain. And it's pretty obvious to John's initial listeners that the throne means that there's a real power, a living God who's in charge, and not the fake emperor who is the one putting all the pressure on them. And that the slain lamb represents Jesus of Nazareth, who somehow in his life and his death and his resurrection has taken away with everything that gets in the way of God's project moving forward. John's also seen a scroll, a book, that seems to represent a plan or a movement or a process that God now wants to put into place to put everything back together or back on track. But before that can happen, what's revealed as the scroll is gradually unopened and seals are removed, big lumps of wax that would have kept it secure, is the state of the problem, the state of the creation project. And that state, that condition, that diagnosis is not a surprise. What's pictured in lots of different ways are endless cycles of empire, of war, of infighting, of inequality, of famine, of pollution and death. Vividly displayed as four horsemen. A creation then shaking apart, tearing apart at the seams by its own choices. This diagnosis is that parts of creation are constantly in rebellion against the way God made them to be, and that these fake powers, typically in empire mode, in exploiting mode, in consuming mode, in selfish me mode, are actually tearing the whole creation project apart. And yet this God will not give up and will act to put things back together. And in the face of that, the powers, the kings, the princes, the high and mighty will be hiding because they're terrified at how powerfully God will put things back together. The question's then asked, who, in the face of this, who can stand? Well, the obvious answer is no one. But right at the start of chapter 7, what we have is a pause in the action. John then sees, it almost goes back in time, John sees a different angle or a perspective on the same situation, the same diagnosis. And this time, those destructive forces are represented as four winds. The image of four corners of the earth has from ancient times been a symbol of the total problem. But this image is of winds, of angels, God's instruments, actually holding back these harmful forces. The same kind of forces that were represented by four horsemen in the previous perspective. These winds are symbolic of the human condition and the harmful effects it plays out in destructive ways on God's project. John then sees an angel from the east. In the Genesis poems at the start of this collection of books we call the Bible, The garden God created was in the east. So this angel from God calls the four angels or the four winds or the four horsemen, the effects of these consequences, to pause. And remember, these consequences aren't harmful effects that God's chosen to play out on his creation. This isn't a grumpy, punishing God. These are consequences the parts of the creation have chosen. Humanity, time and time again, chooses to replace God, to take control, to organise things their own way, and this heartbroken God allows this to play out, but only for a time. So in this vision, there's a pause, and the servants of God, God's followers, have a mark, a seal, put on their foreheads. In the last part of the vision, the last perspective on this, and it's coming from all different angles, God's followers who suffered were actually pictured as safe under the altar, crying out, being asked to hold on and rest. Here the picture is of God's followers being marked or sealed as belonging to God before the harmful effects begin. John's listeners would have grown up hearing year after year their story, the roots of their story, in a book called Exodus, where God dealt with the destructive empire of the time powerfully, but he passed over God's people when they marked their doorposts with the blood of a lamb. Notice that this angel doesn't say, I'm going to mark these people as God's servants and then nothing bad will happen to them. The reality is the consequences of this repeated rebelling of parts of creation, of empires, of selfish focus, affects everyone and everything. God's followers who aren't rebelling, who are trying to be who he made them to be, who are trying to love, to care, to tend, to bring this creation to its potential, still suffer and still die like everyone around. In this image, they're not being protected from what happens, but they're being protected through what happens. What God seems to be saying is that he will not leave them. They're not forgotten. His identity is on them. They are not alone. And then the vision turns to some numbers. And so there's a number, 144,000, which is the exact number of people who will get to go to heaven. Wait a minute. It doesn't sound right, does it? I hope that you don't think it sounds right. If you've been journeying with us through this letter, if you've been journeying with us through the poems of Genesis, through the stories of the life of Jesus, his life and his death and his resurrection in books like Matthew and John, if you've been wrestling with the writings in these scriptures in your own small groups, then I hope this doesn't sound right to you. What we've seen already in this letter, in the Revelation, is that this is a God who's sending a message of comfort and challenge. And that message of comfort is that the struggles and the suffering, the pressure, the opposition to what God is doing will have a limit. But that is the only limit. There's been no limit set in these stories on God's justice, mercy, grace, love. No limit on his invitation, no limit on who can respond, which is why God is waiting, it seems, as long as possible for things and for everyone to turn around. I think you would agree with most writers on the Revelation that this number, 144,000, sounds suspiciously neat. Numbers, it should be obvious as you read through this, are hugely symbolic to the ancient mind, to the Jewish mind, to the Hebrew way of thinking. They're meaningful. 3, 7, 12. We've had 7 lamps, 7 churches representing all the groups of Jesus' followers. We've had 4 living creatures. We've had the 4 horsemen, the 4 winds, the 4 corners. We've had 24 elders, a multiple of 12. 144,000 is a multiple of 12. 12 times 12, 10 times 10. 12, the symbol throughout these stories for the 12 tribes of Israel. And then later in this, for the 12 disciples, the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, representing a new Israel. A bigger picture of all God's followers that's not limited by one tribe. Just as 4 represented the whole when talking about winds and corners and horsemen, 10 is a representation of completeness. And so 10 times 10 represents just the biggest number you can think of in Hebrew thought. 144,000 seems to me a number that represents completeness and hugeness. But it's not a literal fixed number. We're told the Jewish people in the first century would have numbered around about 5 to 10, estimates range and vary, million. I don't think that the message John is putting across is that roughly 1.4% of them are being protected and getting the prize and the rest can forget it. It seems reasonable to me to see that what John is talking about, or what is being revealed to John, is that this is about all God's people, the complete new Israel. Not just the Jewish people, but this new bigger image of the new Israel, where people are invited in, that Jesus has been revealing in his life. All God's people. In fact, if we were to skip ahead, which I don't like doing, to the end of this letter, we'll find there an image of a city with 12 tribes names in it, but also in the foundations, the names of the 12 disciples. The idea of all of God's people being much bigger. This story has never limited the invitation. Never limited to the Jews, never limited in any way. Earlier in his letter, John told us that he heard one thing about a Lion of Judah, but then he saw something different, a lamb being slain. And the expectation of the time was that a warrior king would sort out their problems, but the reality was that a slain lamb, that the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth would deal with much, much bigger problems than they realised they had. John here hears a number, 144,000, but then just a few words later he sees something different. He sees a huge, countless multitude from every nation. And this has been the story of these scriptures all along. From the very first poems of Genesis, that God created and wants to bless his whole creation. All nations. His project is for everyone and everything. And he wants them to respond to him, to turn around, to come back. The invitation is to all. But this is no fantasy story, despite the signs and the symbols and the metaphors. This is a description of a painful reality, exposing the human condition, that evil is a reality. And that God, heartbroken, allows his creation to experience the consequences of its own choices up to a point. God doesn't give up. God is at work. God is with his people. And there will be a limit. He is at work. He has already acted decisively in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and he will put this plan to put everything back together into action, because there's nothing in the way. But meanwhile, this God will not allow the evil, the opposition, the effects, the consequences to get between him and those who are responding to him. Those who feel in their bones that this is who they were made to be, who recognize in this story who they were made to be and what they were made for. God has them in his care. God has set them apart, which is what the word holy means. God is not going to allow the full effects of evil, the suffering, the war, the famine, the pollution, even death, to keep them from their relationship with him, from the life, the eternal kind of life is described in here, that is part of the plan, the movement, the process that's now able to move forward. An ancient rabbi called Paul puts it like this in his own letter to Jesus' followers in Rome in the first century. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. Signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours.